Thank you to everyone for coming. We're going to wait a minute while everybody gets into the room. All right, good morning and welcome everyone to the Ability Center of Greater Toledo's 4th Annual ADA Seminar. I am Katie Hunt-Thomas, the Disability Rights Attorney and Director of Advocacy at the Ability Center of Greater Toledo, which is a center for independent living serving 7 counties in Northwest Ohio, and an organization that supports people with disabilities to live independently in the community. This year, the COVID-19 pandemic has put a spotlight on familiar barriers facing people with disabilities that have become even more urgent within our current state of national emergency. With this year's ADA seminar, we hope to share information on how to respond to 4 of those barriers: website access, barriers facing people with disabilities in day-to-day living during COVID, emergency planning, and health equity. Thank you so much for being here with us to learn more about what our community is facing right now. With that, I will introduce the host of the ADA seminar this year, Katie Shelley. Katie is a disability.
Oh, go ahead, Katie, sorry.
All right. Katie is a disability rights advocate focused on public access and healthcare at the Ability Center of Greater Toledo. She received her Bachelor of Arts in English Literature from Western Michigan University, cum laude, her Master of Library and Information Science from Wayne State University, and most recently her Master of Liberal Studies with a concentration on Disability Studies from the University of Toledo. Katie is very passionate about disability rights and endeavors to implement systemic change through her position as a disability rights advocate. Thank you again to everyone for coming, and I'll turn this over to Katie. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you, Katie. Hello, as Katie said, my name is Katie Shelley, and I would like to welcome you to the first of 4 sessions as part of our 4th annual ADA seminar. The ADA seminar came about as a way for us to connect with ADA coordinators throughout our area and to help educate them on what is required under the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you would like to be part of our ADA coordinator network and are not already, don't hesitate to reach out to me at kshelley@abilitycenter.org, and I will make sure that you are added to our listserv. I send out blog posts on ADA-related themes every couple of months and keep ADA coordinators up to date on trainings provided. I am also more than happy to meet one-on-one with local jurisdictions to provide technical assistance regarding the ADA. Now, just some housekeeping items before we get started. As a reminder, we have 3 more webinars coming up as part of our ADA seminar series. All of them start at 10 a.m. This coming Thursday, October 8th, we have a panel discussion featuring local disability advocates discussing how COVID-19 has impacted accessibility. Next Tuesday, October 13th, Speaker Valerie Novak will be discussing emergency preparedness and disability during the COVID-19 pandemic. Lastly, on October 15th, we will have a panel on healthcare equity during COVID-19, where representatives from the Hospital Council of Northwest Ohio will discuss their collaboration with the Ability Center on the revision of guidelines for resource allocation for people with disabilities in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. A reminder, if you are registered for all 4 sessions, you are entered to win a grab bag with ACT swag, including a Toledo is for Everyone t-shirt. For today's webinar on website access, we welcome Bruce Bailey, Accessibility IT Specialist with the United States Access Board. Bruce Bailey has lead responsibility for the U.S. Access Board website and provides technical assistance on Section 508 as the policy relates to websites and software. Bruce has been working for over 20 years in the field of assistive technology, and more than 10 of those years in the federal government. Bruce is also an invited expert with the W3C WAI Web Content Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, and is also an ex officio member of the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standards, or NIMAS board. And before Bruce gets started, I would just like to let you know that we do encourage you to ask questions, and Bruce will answer them at the end of the presentation. My coworker, fellow disability rights advocate Jimmy Russell, will keep track of the questions for us, and feel free to ask those questions throughout the presentation, but we do ask that you use the Q&A tab as opposed to the chat. Don't put questions in chat, put them in the Q&A tab. And now I would like to introduce Bruce Bailey. Bruce?
Thank you, Katie. I'm Bruce Bailey. I work with at the United States Access Board. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. And I'm very pleased to be here this morning with you all. I want to start off though by congratulating and complimenting or making note of, oh, my slide advance key, there we go, that this webinar is a model of web access and web accessibility. And the main questions that asked as the planning went into this webinar is can people with disabilities participate? What are we going to do to facilitate their participation? So the platform chosen and the accommodations integrated into this presentation include that. So we've got captioning, we have American Sign Language interpreting, we've chosen a web platform that is compatible with screen reading software, meaning that you can, one of the things is that it's very usable using only a keyboard. And then of course the host and presenter mindfulness. And one of the things I will mention with that is that I'm going to try and do a very good job. If I've got text on the screen, it's probably important enough for me to read it out loud, so I will. If it seems like I'm reading my slides, it's because I'm reading my slides. But if I've got it on the if I have text on the slide, it's important enough to make sure that I say it out loud. And that also helps people that might only be participating via the phone, which of course the Zoom platform facilitates. And then the other thing that I've been encouraging and heard from other resources as well is that, you know, the disability community is well practiced in all the things that been happening in the country for the last 6 months or more. You know, working from home full time. That's something people with disabilities have been using and taking advantage of. And then social distancing. Many people with disabilities have compromised immune systems, and they have no choice but to practice good social distancing. So we have got a plethora of expertise and experience in the disability community with everything the country is experiencing right now. So I'm going to be talking about website accessibility. An hour is a very short period of time for me to touch on all the things that I want to talk about. I do some seminars I used to do some seminars in Washington, D.C. You know, I spent a whole day talking about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So I'm just going to be giving you the highlights here in this hour. But I want to give an overview of how people with disabilities use the web. Then I'm going to talk about Section 508 and why Section 508 is important. That's going to lead me into talking about WCAG, this thing called WCAG or WCAG, WCAG. And then getting to the questions people usually have is, how do I tell if my website has accessibility issues? And if my website does have accessibility issues, what do I do? So you won't be an expert by any means by the end of this, but we will touch on all of those things. And I look forward especially to your questions in the last 15 minutes or so. I do need to do a little commercial for my agency, the Access Board. We were created in 1973 as the Architectural Transportation Barriers and Compliance Board. We're an independent micro agency. We've got about 30 people on staff. We have 25 board members. My former boss liked to joke that we've got more letters in the name of my agency than we have people on staff. I mean, we're really very much a boutique agency, but we're not part of the Department of Ed. We're not part of the Department of Justice. We're not part of General Services Administration. We are very much an independent executive level agency. Gives us a good bit of freedom and discretion, but you know, we're also subject to all of the same bureaucracies that any other executive agency would be subject to. We're not the smallest independent executive agency, but we are, we're probably in the top 10 there of terms of tiny agencies. I mentioned the 25 board members, 13 of those are presidential appointees. So those are our public board members, the ones that do, they meet every 6 times a year. They're the ones that are most enthusiastic about the work because they are the presidential appointees. And as such, it's a capstone on many of these people's career who have worked all their lives in disability issues. And then we have 12 senior federal agency representatives, and those folks are very senior, typically assistant secretaries or deputy secretaries from agencies that you have heard of, including the Department of Defense, General Services Administration, Department of Justice, Department of Education, just to name 4 out of the 10. So we maintain and develop, the main thing is we develop and maintain design criteria, accessibility standards and guidelines. It's regulation, if you will. What are the measurements, the metrics for something being accessible or not? And then we provide technical assistance and training on those design criteria. So it's very much part of my day-to-day job to be here, to be invited here. So thank you for inviting me and to participate in this. I'm not doing anyone a favor by being here. I'm just doing my job. So we develop these accessibility requirements and provide the technical assistance in a wide variety of environments. For the built environment, your buildings and your public rights of way, your streets and sidewalks, transit vehicles, so those big buses, trains, don't do planes, but the big public transportation vehicles, telecommunications equipment, and information communication technology. I put that one last because that's what I'm talking about today, the one that's most important to me. So these accessibility standards and guidelines are also driven by statutes. So the Americans with Disability Act, which everyone has heard of course, probably the broadest. We don't do enforcement, but we do get to write the guidelines and standards. Then there's the Architectural Barriers Act, which if you remember my previous slide, that's what really kicked off started the Access Board, again, buildings. And then we write the guidelines under Section 255 of the Telecommunication Acts. So anything with dealing with phones and websites related to telecommunications. And then Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is, I'm going to be talking quite a lot. And again, it was a Section 508 standards that really brought the Access Board into this area. And really, it's really what got me my first job in Washington, D.C. So I'm very grateful for that, Section 508 of the Rehab Act. Before going into more technical details, I want to take a quick think about how people with disabilities use the web. And first, we're going to ask about, how do people use the web in general? Well, you've got your preferred interface, maybe a Windows PC, maybe an Apple Macintosh, maybe your mobile phone, maybe a tablet of some kind. You've got the web browser of choice. So on the desktop, that's going to be Chrome or Firefox or Internet Explorer, or Safari or Edge. Those are the top 5. There are others. Well, all of that is true and the same for people with disabilities. So how do people with disabilities use the web? Well, you've got the platform of choice. That is a mainstream web browser. There have been some experimental web browsers for people with disabilities, but those have never been very commercially successful. So most people with disabilities are going to use hardware and software as is the same as everyone else. Now, there might be that some people with disabilities customize the settings, but that's even common in the mainstream. So maybe you like a quote unquote dark setting where you've got white characters on a black background instead of black characters on a white background. Easier to look at, less tired on the eyes. Or maybe you have a zoom setting. Zoom settings are built into every web browser. But then, of course, some people with disabilities also use assistive technology. The main one people in my field talk about is screen reading software. So that's software that adds speech output for any application, but in particular for your web browser. And that's the main thing that I think we concern ourselves with accessibility is compatibility with screen reading software that is used by somebody who's blind. That's really one of the major benchmarks for what we mean by accessible. So this was quick, and I want to send out some links to more and better examples. One of the nice things to happen in the last several years is that I no longer have to point to people to the Access Board website for resources, because there's so many better and very articulate and very detailed resources. So I'm going to be pitching stuff at the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. So w3.org is their main domain. And if you go to w3.org/WAI, which stands for Web Accessibility Initiative, w3.org/WAI, that gets you to a whole wealth of resources. So the first one I'll mention here is w3.org/WAI/people-use-web, which is how people use the web. And then another really good one for people that are new to accessibility, w3.org/WAI/fundamentals/accessibility-intro. And that's really a very good overview, I think, of accessibility and assistive technology. Slide 10, I said I was going to be saying my slide numbers, and that's the very first time that I've mentioned my slide number for people that are working, looking at the materials offline. So I apologize for that. Very easy for even seasoned presenters to forget some of these basic steps. So the accessibility of platforms is very good. Microsoft Windows, lots of accessibility baked in. Apple with both OS X, their computer platform, and iOS, the platform on the phones, on their iPhone. Google Android, great accessibility features built in on that. So on your desktop, the operating system and web browsers work well using only the keyboard. So that means they're going to work well if you add assistive technology like the screen reading software. On mobile, the same thing. You've got screen reading, the talking built in as an option. You've got the zooming built in. So the platform of the web browser that comes with your phone, with your smartphone, works really well with the phone's accessibility features. Slide 11. So what's the problem? The hardware has good accessibility. The operating system has good accessibility. The web browsers, the software, the main thing you're using, has really good accessibility. Well, life is good. In fact, life is better than, for people with disabilities and people that need assistive technology, is better than it's been ever. Really peak. But the content is the problem. Slide 12. The author, the writer of a web page, mostly controls the accessibility, which seems really kind of bizarre that you can have somebody who's a very seasoned computer user. They've got the latest phone, they've got the latest browser, they've got the latest technology, the latest assistive technology, and they can still get stopped on a page by somebody who's a newbie developer, a newbie content author. So my example, classic example, if the author adds a meaningful and informational graphic or image, say you've got a chart or a graph or anything that, you know, it's really, really important, well, anything that conveys meaning, the author needs to add descriptive identification or a text equivalent. And if the author doesn't do that, it's really hard for the seasoned expert computer user to get by that in many cases. So slide 13, where we're talking about section 508, section 508, it's that the web accessibility is not new. A little quick history lesson, the Trace Center out in the University of Wisconsin, now they've moved to Maryland. They initiated and distributed and coordinated a set of web accessibility standards or guidelines, or called the Unified Website Accessibility Guidelines Central Reference Document in June of 1997. The first version, the last version I could find of that was version 7.2. So that tells you that it went through several different revisions getting up to that June 1997 version. Shortly after that, we had the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 1.0, WCAG. That was a W3C recommendation in May 1999. Now, recommendation seems like it's kind of a weak word, but that's actually the standards, the metrics, well, they're not regulation, but the requirements, the technical documents that the W3C issues are called technical reports, TR. So that explains the URL, w3.org/TR/WCAG 10, WCAG 1, 0. And so that was the first, codified description of what it means for a website to be accessible. It was really very good, but there were some gaps, some difficulties with it. So the original Section 508 standards in December 2000, so not, 18 months later, this was in Section 1194.22 of Section 508, web-based intranet and internet information and applications. And I give the Federal Register citation here. So the Federal Register has short URLs, but they're a little bit cryptic. So Federal Register, all one word, federalregister.gov/D/00-32017. So that gives you the Federal Register publication of that day, and that's where these Section 508 standards in December 2000 came out. So that was the federal government saying, hey, this is what something for a website to be accessible. These are the criteria that we'll use. These are the features we'll use. Slide 15. Well, that was a while ago, 20 years, huh? And the W3C itself started working, has volunteer committees. They started working on a new version of the guidelines, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0. That was finished as a W3C recommendation in December 2008. And using the same URL scheme, that's w3.org/tr/WCAG20. The United States Access Board started trying to update the 508 regulations in 2006, but we didn't get that finished and out till January of 2017. So that's what we call the revised Section 508 standards. The phrase we were used during those 10 years is called the quote unquote ICT refresh unquote. And the direct URL to go to those is access-board.gov/508. The W3C work continues and is ongoing. They came out with a WCAG 2.1 recommendation in June 2018. This doesn't affect 508 because 508 is a snapshot in time. The W3C folks are working on WCAG 2.2 and a WCAG 3.0, or Silver as they call it. Those won't become requirements under 508 until the Access Board initiates another rulemaking, which at a minimum is a 2-year-long process. So really just looking at the WCAG 2.0 for now is what's in the United States and what it's in the federal government. But anyway, if you want to take a look at the WCAG 2.1, w3.org/tr/WCAG21. Slide 16, a question we get all the time are our non-federal websites required to comply with the 508 standards? And the quick answer is no. That's, Section 508 only applies to federal agencies when they procure, maintain, use, or develop information communication technology. Section 508 itself does not apply beyond federal government, between federal agencies and the contracts we issue. However, in lots of cases, compliance with 508 might be required by other rules and regulations. So there's universities that will say, well, we're going to follow the 508 requirements. Many state and local governments say we're going to do what the federal government does. So in that case, those requirements might be binding in your situation. And then the other thing is that the 508 standards can serve as useful guidance for any entity really that is interested in providing good access. So I've kind of hinted at this why I'm talking about WCAG, and it's because the revised 508 standards use direct incorporation by reference, IBR, of WCAG 2.0. And I have my one and only graphic here trying to illustrate that concept, that WCAG 2.0 is divided into 3 categories of success criteria of metrics for accessibility, A, AA, and AAA. The 508 standards incorporate WCAG 2.0 A and AA success criteria, but we didn't incorporate by reference the AAA criteria. So in my circle here, that's why there's some overlap and why the AAA is inside of WCAG but outside of the 508 standards. But my 508 bubble here is much bigger than WCAG 2.0 because 508 addresses a lot of other things besides just websites. Slide 19. So we have this revised 508 standards has a broad application of WCAG 2.0, that WCAG 2.0 level A and level AA success criteria and conformance requirements, and we applied them not just to web content, say your instructional materials that you've got on the web, but we cover non-web documents. So that might be instructional materials that are not web content. They're distributed via email, so it's broader than just online instructional materials. but we also apply WCAG to software. So my example there is a learning management system. Again, in a school, school or university environment, it might be not that LMS, learning management system, might not be anything that students interact with directly, but it's important for the people, the teachers, and the administrators of the educational materials. So in the federal context, that would be something that would be covered. Slide 20. Just another shout out to WCAG 2.0, that it's an international standards. The background and development is international, multi-stakeholders, for-profit, non-profit, advocacy, people that are involved in that. They have weekly calls. So, I mean, it's ongoing, and it's it's very transparent how they do their work. And at this point, there's been many countries and organizations that have adopted it. I like to use the W3C has a list of official translations, so that's kind of a minimal level of ways to know how worldwide and extensive it is. And then in 2012, they got it endorsed by the International Standards Organization, which is kind of the cold seal of approval, if you will. So that's all. WCAG 2.0 was also known as ISO/IEC 4500:2012, 2012 being the year. So it's ISO document 4500. So standards harmonization and having this kind of coordination really does advance accessibility. There's one metric for what's the minimal level of accessibility. So that really helps and have a comfort level for anyone who's concerned about accessibility. Another feature I like about WCAG is that the table of contents is a top 12 list, not quite a top 10 list. People ask me, well, just give me the top 10 things I have to do. Well, I'm going to tell you the top 12 things you have to do, kind of paraphrasing them. But again, this is just from looking at the highest level organization in the WCAG document itself. So it's w3.org/tr/WCAG20/pound content. So that's an anchor towards the top of the document, listing and organizing all of the success criteria. So provide text alternatives for non-text content. Provide captions and other alternatives for multimedia. Create content that can be presented in different ways, including by assistive technologies, without losing meaning. Make it easier for users to see and hear content. Make all functionality available from the keyboard. Give users enough time to read and use content. And continuing, avoid content that causes seizures or physical reactions. Help users navigate and find content. Make text readable and understandable. Make content appear and operate in predictable ways. Help users avoid and correct mistakes. And then finally, maximize compatibility with current and future user tools, future browsers. And there's a nice overview of these 12 these 12 guidelines, these 12 main ideas at w3.org/WAI/standards-guidelines/WCAG/glance. Kind of a nice quick overview. So if you're getting started with WCAG 2.0 for the first time, again, I'm going to point you to the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative WAI homepage, w3.org/WAI. I recommend folks get started with the WCAG 2.0 overview, w3.org/WAI standards. w3.org/WAI/standards-guidelines/WCAG. I gave a deeper URL from there on my previous slide. The standard is written to be a good starting point. It's very unusual in the standard world to have standards that are designed for lay people that are approaching and not, engineers. So it's written to be as simple as it can be without being simpler than it, without being too simple. So it really works as well as it probably can from that perspective. The WCAG introduction and layer of guidance, they talk about principles, guidelines, success criteria, and then techniques. Each success criteria, which I'll talk about in a minute, has contextual links. If you're just going through the WCAG document, each of those success criteria has links out to more resources about understanding and how to meet. WCAG also features slide 24. It features these success criteria that are written as testable statements that are not technology specific. So they're basically, true, false assertions. Each of these success criteria is assigned a level, A, AA, AAA. So basically, which are the things that are easiest, and then medium difficulty, and then most difficult to do. The revised 508 adopted level AA, which includes a level A success criteria as being the right level for the federal government, and it was the right level that matches what was in the 2000 standards. The structure of WCAG provides kind of a built-in prioritization path that you've got 4 success criteria that are associated with what's a conformance requirement 5 for non-interference, and I'll show those. Then there's other level single A success criteria if you're getting started. If you've addressed all your level A success criteria, then address the AA success criteria. That gets you to a point where you're quote unquote 508 conforming. If you go ready to go do more, start addressing AAA success criteria as your resources allow. Slide 25, I mentioned want to talk a little bit more about the WCAG document organization, that it puts the success criteria into 4 categories. It's just kind of an arbitrary, a little bit kind of grouping principles. So there's 4 principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. And it makes sense in kind of a hierarchy, in that if you can't perceive something, you're not going to be able to operate it. Once you can perceive something, operate it, then maybe you can go to a higher level and make it understandable. So those are kind of the most concrete, perceivable, to a little bit less concrete with operable and understandable, and then finally robust, which is the future proofing. If you look at a WCAG success criteria, it'll have a 3-digit numbering. So that numbering comes from those 4 principles. So 1 or more guidelines under each principle, 1 or more success criteria under each guideline. So if I talk about success criteria 1.2.3, that was going to be the first principle, the second guideline under that first principle, and then the third success criteria under that second guideline under that first principle. Slide 26, am I conforming with WCAG or 2.0 or not? Am I conforming? Am I accessible? Well, if you conform to WCAG 2.0, and this is in the WCAG 2.0 document itself, that you satisfy all success criteria at that given level. You can't be, say, your WCAG AA except for success criteria 1.2.3. That's kind of a nonsensical statement. You need to be AA conforming or single A conforming, or in terms of what does it mean to be conform to WCAG. Not applicable success criteria are satisfied by default. So like there's a requirement in WCAG for captioning of videos. Well, if you have no videos, no multimedia, then you've met that success criteria. Conformance applies to an entire page. You can't say, well, our website's conforming except for the middle of this one page. Well, then your website's not conforming. And some success criteria apply to multi-page processes. So for example, if you've got a shopping site, you can't say, well, we're accessible except for our place order button. You've got to, either the whole process is accessible or it's not. And then I'll mention the caveat at the bottom of the screen here that conformance to AA or even AAA does not mean 100% accessibility. There will be people that need more out of a level AA conforming website. So, I mean, accessibility is very personal. The WCAG standards are kind of the best way to set the stage for what is accessible or what's not. But even if you are AA conforming or AAA conforming, you may still have people that have difficulties with your website. So don't disrespect that, please. Slide 27, how can I tell if my website has accessibility issues? So this is, of course, a very important thing that people want to know. I'm going to share with you some simple tests and some free resources. Triaging website accessibility is kind of a very popular approach, to do things that are easy and big and easy to spot. W3C has some great resources on that. Easy checks first. w3.org/WAI/test-evaluate/preliminary. They also have a very, I also want to cite out here to another organization called WebAIM that's been working on web accessibility and providing resources for a very long time, www.webaim.org/resources/eval quick ref, all one word put together, EVALQUICKREF. So that's their quick reference for testing web content and for accessibility. And then the other thing that I'll mention to folks, again, taking advantage of how the W3C standard is organized, the WCAG conformance requirements for non-interference. So it's going a little deeper into the document, w3.org/tr/WCAG 20 and then, machine testing is good. Scanning, if you've got utilities, and there's lots of them available. I'm going to talk about a few of the 3 of the free ones that are very good. But there's also lots of great commercial products for scanning websites. Slide 29, talk about this WCAG conformance requirement 5 for non-interference. So this is the 5th out of 5 conformance requirements, and it lists out 4 success criteria. So here you can get a sense for the naming and the numbering of these success criteria in general. I'm going to be paraphrasing what the success criteria means. But my first example, or this is the exhaustive list actually of the 4 success criteria that are called out in conformance requirement 5 for non-interference. 1.4.2. So again, that's the first guideline, first principle, 4th guideline, 2nd success criteria. 1.4.2 audio control. Is there sound or music that plays automatically? If there is, there's got to be a way to stop it if it goes more than 3 or 5 seconds. I forget the exact number there. Success criteria 2.1.2, no keyboard trap. And a quick test for this is, can you tab through the page and back to the beginning? This used to be a huge problem on websites. It seems to be enough attention has been raised to it. And also Flash as a technology was pretty infamous for being a problem on websites for people using assistive technology. They would tab around the web page and they'd get to a Flash object, and it didn't matter if the Flash object wasn't really that important. It kind of froze the keyboard access. You couldn't tab past the Flash object. And now the Flash has fallen out of favor. This is much less of an issue. So no keyboard trap. Success criteria 2.2.2, pause, stop, hide. And again, so that's 2nd principle. So that was operable. 2nd guideline, 2nd success criteria within that 2nd guideline. Pause, stop, hide. So be careful with any animations or automatic movement. So this is a requirement that animations are short, or that there's a way to stop them, interrupt them, or a way to make them so they're not showing up on the page. So, and again, this falls under a non-interference requirement because it's really, it's basically a showstopper for somebody using assistive technology and screen reading technology in particular. If there's some animation, it can freeze the screen reading software, or it makes noise that the screen reading software has to talk over or through, and it's really a huge blocker. Also for people, sometimes people with cognitive disabilities, that they, there's some animation on the page that they can't stop. It's very distracting to the point where they can't even interact with any of the other content. And then another classic example, 2.3.1, 3 flashes are below threshold. So is there any I'll say right here, non-trivial blinking or flashing. So if there's any blinking that's fast and big and red, and there's actual formulas in WCAG for determining, if you've got something that's blinking, some animation that's flashing, is it dangerous or not? The simplest thing is just to avoid it. So if it's blinking at a rate slower than 3 blinks per second, which is something you can pretty much count out, that's not going to cause a seizure. So this is, they had experience with this in Japan, where they broadcast some cartoon that put all these kids caused all these kids to have seizures. So, something that's actually literally life-threatening in a web accessibility standard. Slide 30, there's some other easy checks. And again, I'm cribbing these from the resources that I put on the previous slides. Poor contrast between text foreground and background. So the low contrast is one of the biggest things that wasn't in WCAG 1.0, that wasn't in the original 508 standards, and it's easy to test for, and it's a huge blocker. So you want good contrast between your text and your background. Missing and bad alternative text, that's one thing people talk about all the time. Alt text for images and graphics. So that's not, you'll notice I'm going to go back a slide here, slide 29. That's not actually in the non-interference Back to slide 30, poor missing bad alt text, one of the classic things of problems, but it's not actually a showstopper per se, it's just a big old question mark. Love single A obstacle success criteria. Improper heading structure or none at all. Proper heading structure can be very important for people with disabilities, people using screen reading technology, people with learning disabilities, and there's some requirements listed relating to heading structure in WCAG. Loss of meaning and organization when you zoom. So the very minimal requirement in WCAG 2.0 is that zoom up to 200% be supported without causing loss of context. Again, also helps a lot with mobility, of course. Lack of lack of form input labels. So this is something that's very easy for folks to make mistakes with. And if they're putting up forms for the first time, you just put up a blank form, you think you've got a visual label for it. Well, you need to tie that visual label to the text input field. And then ambiguous links, redundant links, empty links, all those things are blockers for assistive technology, even if they're not invisible. I talked about that machine testing, and I wanted to give these three examples. How are we doing with my time? Looks like we're doing well here. Okay, so I'll mention the functional evaluator from the University of Illinois. I'm not gonna, if we had more time, I'd love to demo all of these things, but each one of these, you can find programs on that go on for an hour or two for each one of these tools individually. That's fae.disability.illinois.edu. That's one of the earliest tools. It's one of the most structured, and it also has a reporting interface. So people tend to favor, there's been a long time people want, tools that return a score. The FAE, the functional evaluator, accessibility evaluator, includes that feature. So it does let you plot progress over time. Scoring a website for accessibility, besides saying, well, it's single A or double A or it's not, just giving a numerical score is something that's very much under dispute, that you can't, it's really hard to say a website's 90% accessible. It's just, that doesn't mean very much. But if you have a tool that's reporting a score, you can at least see if your website is improving over time in terms of accessibility. These other two that I list here, the WAVE Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool from WebAIM, Web Accessibility Mind, wave.webaim.org. And then the ANDI, Accessible Name and Descriptor Inspector from Social Security Administration, SSA, that's ssa.gov/accessibility/ANDI, ANDI. Those are both organized to be tools for developers. They're a little bit interactive. Well, they're very much interactive. So I've got a screenshot that gives a little bit of an example of WAVE. So you go to the Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool, wave.webaim.org. It just asks you to type in a web address, and it'll pop up. It'll take that web page, and it looks like we went to the United States Senate's page for this thing, for this example, and then it inserts graphics showing accessibility features or possibility lack of accessibility features. So we've got on this web screenshot of the United States Access site, there's a lot of the first thing that's visually noticeable are these red squares with question marks inside them. So that's a question asking if there's where the link goes to, and at the top it says document language missing. The language of the document is not identified. So there, and then you can dig into each of these features that are there. And basically, red things are things that are concerns, and green things are features. So for example, there's an image of the flag, and it says Alt USS flag. So it takes the alternative text and exposes it as plain text and puts in a little badge. But the big caveat here is that automated tools cannot tell you if a page is accessible or compliant, but they can help you identify impactful issues. So there's, the people that develop these accessibility tools, the numbers I've heard are between 20, 25, 30% of errors going to be identified by a computer. So really, accessibility is much more of a manual process than anything that a computer can fix. So if your website has accessibility issues, what do? Slide 34, now to 35. Please be proactive. Get commitment from leadership. designate responsible individuals that have the ability to make changes, make plans, and it's kind of a cycle: assess, remediate, maintain. And then after you do a remediation, you're going to have to go back to assessment. Once you get going, the maintenance is still going to be an ongoing concern, but it's very much a cycle to assess, maintain, remediate, maintain. Get some of find the expertise, which you may be able to develop in-house very much so. Accessibility is something that most web developers have added to the portfolio. If you're asking people about, mastering CSS, they'll know about web accessibility. If you're asking them about security or mobile, they will have heard of WCAG and hopefully be doing it. And then the other thing you can do to obviate some problems is to figure out interim accessibility and services. So if you know you're not going to be able to provide a conforming website right away, maybe you can stand up some phone access or email access, trying just as kind of a band-aid, but providing human contact and human alternatives generally isn't, you can't use those things to say, well, we're accessible because we do these things with our inaccessible website. Web accessibility is very much a stand on its own kind of thing. Slide 36, in terms of remediating website, accessibility is inexpensive if addressed early in the planning stage, can be very expensive after that. It's not uncommon for websites, web projects, initiatives to have to be done, documents to have to be done entirely redone from scratch because the accessibility issues are so bad. Absolutely develop a prioritization remediation plan. What are your most visited pages? What are your key services? Can you address many page accessibility issues with a single template? So you've got a content management system. Maybe you can fix things just by updating your template a little bit. And especially pay attention to what issues have user raised. Sometimes people will say, you can get people complaining about things that are really very trivial. Like we had, I'll give an example. Just yesterday, somebody's complaining about access board websites because we didn't have an audio description on our button on our videos. Well, all of our animation videos have running audio description from the get-go. We designed them so that they would work well over the phone. There's somebody describing what's going on the entire time. If we had an audio description button, it would just play the main audio track. So, but we don't have an audio description button on our animations. So sometimes issues are serious, or maybe they're more subtle. So we had a complaint not long ago that our page titles weren't very informative, and we took a look at that and they were absolutely right. So we changed the order. So instead of saying US Access Board Section 508, the page title now reads Section 508 US Access Board, because they want to hear the most important information first. And then, develop a maintenance plan. What are you going to do going forward once you remediate the most pressing issues? If you have to evaluate third-party services, it's very hard for people that are not web accessibility experts to really know how to screen for accessibility. But what do you do for privacy, security, copyright infringement, making sure you're not sharing addresses and phone numbers? Those are all very subtle things that you expect your web developers to be able to answer. They should be able to give good answers for accessibility too. There's lots of accessibility products, consultants and firms available. So get quotes, talk to a couple people. Unfortunately, there's no formal credentialing for accessibility. So if you see somebody selling a badge, they're selling a badge that might not have a lot of credibility. Well, it doesn't have much credibility behind it because there is no formal credentialing. There are some generally accepted practices and procedures. In the federal government, there's something called trusted tester. So if they follow that protocol, that's great. But again, there's nobody that's certifying trusted tester tested websites. There's only a certification process for the trusted testers themselves. And once again, to pitch out to the W3C, they've got a great guidance on selecting web accessibility evaluation tools. w3.org/wii/test-evaluate/tools/selecting. So at this point, we're ready for the third-party questions, or for questions. I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A chat at the moment. So I think we'll go to our poll questions. I don't have those, right? Okay. So Section 508 is part of which law? The Americans with Disability Act, the Architectural Barriers Act, Rehabilitation Act, Telecommunication Act, all of the above or none of the above? And I guess we're going to do both of these questions at the same time. So the second question, conformance with WCAG is part of a regulation associated with which, and it's similar question style, except that it's multiple choice. Americans with Disability Act, Architectural Barriers Act, Rehabilitation Act, or the Telecommunications Act? Do we have Jeopardy music, Jimmy?
I wish.
Wouldn't that be good? And I don't know how we go, what the next step is with this. Okay, so we get the result here. Section 508 is part of which law? See, this happens in my work life all the time. We've got 46% saying Americans with Disability Act and 46% saying Rehabilitation Act, and I guess the other, 8% all of the above, and 0% for Architectural Barrier Act and Telecommunication Act, or none of the above. This is actually a pretty straightforward question. It's the Rehabilitation Act one. So you hear people talk about Section 508, Rehabilitation Act. Not that that matters so much, but people are always thinking that it is part of the American Disability Act. Kind of wish it was, but it is not. And then the other thing I'll mention with this, if you hear about Section 504 type accommodations, that's also part of the Rehabilitation Act. And then one of those other ones set up the access board, and I really feel like I should know what all 501, 502, 503, 504, 5, 6, and 7 are, but I do not. 504, 508. So now let's look at the second question here. Conformance with WCAG is part of regulations associated with select all that apply, multiple choice. This is very much a trick question because it's not, well, it is pretty well settled that website accessibility is part of public accommodation, it's part of effective communication, but WCAG is not cited within the Americans with Disability Act as a standard, but it's very often, especially if there's a lawsuit, WCAG 2.0 is used as a metric for the website being accessible or not. Not in the Architectural Barrier Act, very much in the Rehabilitation Act since we cited out to it. Telecommunications Act also talks about accessibility, but the FCC, which has real purview over the Telecommunication Act, they have not formally endorsed our revised 508 standards, which include the 255 guidelines, and they haven't provided strict citation to WCAG 2.0 either. But, again, if there's issues with website accessibility for telecommunications products is covered by 255, and the FCC looks to the WCAG 2 standards for that as well. So if you picked ADA, Rehabilitation Act, or Telecommunication Act for that second question, I would say if I was a teacher giving this out, I would definitely get full credit for all those answers. Not part of the Architectural Barriers Act because the Architectural Barrier Act really is just buildings and sites. So I'm going to close that. That looks like that worked. Jimmy, I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A section.
Yeah, I don't have any questions that I'm seeing either.
Okay, well, I'm going to go wrap up with my last 3 slides here. So I really want to leave folks with a contact information for the U.S. Access Board. We have dedicated telephone service on the ADA 4 days a week. I think I should have looked up the hours before I got on the phone here, but I think it's like 10 to 4, or maybe it's even 9 to 4 now. Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. So we're also, so the 800-872-2253, 800-993-2822 by TTY. If you're asking web accessibility questions, please direct those to 508@access-board.gov. If you've got more generalized questions about the ADA or the Architectural Barrier Act, those should go to TA@access-board.gov. But for this webinar, I think I'm best off leaving you with the 508@access-board.gov. And our website, www.access-board.gov, and our slogan there on the slide, advancing full access and inclusion for all. I will also want to mention that we have a Section 508 best practice webinar series 6 times a year. 508 webinars every other month, accessibilityonline.org/CIOC-508 for the archives, our website, or that accessibilityonline.org's website to register. In 2017, our focus was on the revised standards. We talked about the final guidelines and standards on, it's one of the easier ways to look through those archives is by date. So on January 31st, 2017, we did an overview. We've had several sections where myself and colleagues talk about WCAG 2.0 and the revised Section 508 standards, the main one being on March 28th, 2017. So that's why I've got that one in bold. We also talked about the things that changed, old versus new, on May 30th, 2017. And then we walked through the Section 508 requirements chapter by chapter, Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. And we did that on June 25th, 2017 and September 26th, 2017. And then we've also had, again, I'm just picking things that are where we talked about WCAG in particular. So we had an open question and answer on April 30th, 2019, and another Section 508 Q&A with the Access Board and GSA on this past January 28th, 2020. And then I really ought to leave.
We do have, we have one question that came in if you would
Yes.
like to take a second to answer that. It's what makes for good alt text or image description? Do you have any advice around that?
So, so that is like the thing we've been wrestling with the entire, almost the entire time of web accessibility. What makes good alt text? And so the rule of thumb I use is, how would you describe the image over the phone to somebody who, you're sharing a document with an informed colleague. There's an important picture. What do you say over the phone to that informed colleague? And that's probably what you would say, what makes up good alt text. That it's descriptive identification at the very minimal, and probably it's some sort of verbal, in this case, or a text equivalent of what the object is. But then the other thing that's really great to do is to just have the longer description. Like if you want to put a chart in, great, put in the picture chart with the bar graphs or whatever, but also attach a spreadsheet or have all the data in a table after or before the graphic. And that way, all the numbers that are in the graphic are readily available, not just to somebody who's using a screen reader, but anybody who's having trouble understanding what your graph is. And then the graph can really, the alt text behind the graph can just kind of summarize why you've got the graph there, as opposed to trying to embed all the description of all the numbers and all the details and all the data, which is really hard to do in the alternative text.
Okay, is that everything you have, Bruce?
Well, let me go through my very last slide so I don't get in trouble.
Okay.
Your question is about, is my website accessible under the ADA? That's really a question for the Department of Justice. And they also have a technical assistance hotline, and I think an email address, and a website that gets into this into good detail, www.ada.gov. The voice number is 800-514-0301. TTY number 800-514-0383. I am very happy, and my colleagues back at the Access Board are very happy to talk about web accessibility standards under WCAG, because that's part of 508. Web accessibility is standards in the federal government, and those are good web accessibility standards for the whole world, really. But in terms of like, is my business website good enough under the ADA? That's a harder question. Thank you, Katie.
Yeah. And so thank you again, Bruce, for joining us today. We really appreciate you being able to talk, just give us a brief overview of website accessibility. So
I know it can't be brief. It's like, geez.
No, but this was good and it was very informative, so we appreciate that. And before everyone leaves, I just wanted to remind everyone to check out our ADA seminar website. I put the link in the chat box, but I will also give it verbally. It is https://abilityseminar-2020-agenda/. And if you have indicated that you are attending these webinars for CLE credit, please make sure you fill out the survey that pops up as you exit this webinar. Please click yes in order to get your CLE code. Also make sure that you provide your bar number so that we can submit the proper documentation to the Ohio Supreme Court on our end. Thank you again to Bruce Bailey, and we hope to see you all again on Thursday for our panel on access during COVID-19. Thank you, everyone.
Before everyone leaves, I got one last question for the panelist team. There was a question that asked if it would be okay to send out the PowerPoint. Is that something we're able to do as well to all the attendees?
So the PowerPoint is included on our seminar website, but we might also be able to send it via email if that's more accessible for someone. They can let us know.
Thank you.